In the quiet hop fields of Victorian England, a phrase was born that we still use today to mean nothing at all, yet its origin is anything but empty. It is soaked in blood. 8-year-old Fanny Adams vanished into the haze of a sultry Saturday, only to be returned in pieces so gruesome they defied human comprehension. How could a man in a respectable suit inflict such absolute desecration on an innocent child in broad daylight? This is not just a murder. It is the shattering of innocence that changed criminal history forever, revealing a darkness that no one saw coming. The sun hung heavy and suffocating over the market town of Alton in Hampshire on that fateful Saturday, August 24th, 1867. It was the kind of oppressive, humid heat that made the air shimmer above the cobblestones and sent the sensible folk of the village retreating into the cool shadows of their stone cottages. But for the children of Alton, the heat was merely a backdrop to the boundless energy of youth. Among them was 8-year-old Fanny Adams, a tall, comely girl with a bright demeanor and a trusting spirit that would ultimately seal her tragic fate. She lived on Tanhouse Lane with her hard-working family, and on this particular afternoon, the world seemed safe, contained within the familiar geography of her neighborhood and the watchful eyes of the community. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, the stifling silence of the house became too much. Fanny, accompanied by her sister Lizzie and their friend Minnie Warner, decided to venture out. They asked Fanny's mother, Harriet, if they could go to the nearby hop garden at the end of the lane. Harriet, busy with the endless chores of a Victorian household, agreed, assuming they would be safe in a place they had visited 1,000 times before. The three girls spilled out into the lane, their laughter ringing out against the droning buzz of insects, completely unaware that a predator was already circling their perimeter. They made their way toward Flood Meadow, a lush, green expanse that served as a playground for the local children. As they walked, the girls spotted a man. He stood out starkly against the rustic backdrop of the meadow. He was dressed not in the rough clothes of a farmhand, but in the respectable attire of a gentleman, a black frock coat, light-colored trousers, and a tall hat. This was Frederick Baker, a 29-year-old solicitor's clerk who worked in town. To the eyes of a child in 1867, a man in such clothing commanded immediate authority and trust. He leaned casually against a gate, watching the girls approach with a gaze that they could not yet interpret as malicious. Baker spoke to them first, his voice calm and steady. He offered Minnie and Lizzie 3 halfpence to go and buy sweets from the confectioner, a gesture that seemed generous to the children. However, there was a condition attached to this charity. He wanted Fanny to stay behind. He offered Fanny a halfpenny as well, ostensibly to accompany him up the lane toward the hollow, a secluded spot known as the Leathers. The dynamic was subtle, but terrifyingly effective. He was separating the herd. Fanny, perhaps sensing a flicker of unease, or simply wishing to stay with her friends, initially refused the coin, but Baker was persistent. He pressed the coin into her hand, and then, to sweeten the deal further, he picked a few wild blackberries and offered them to her. The innocence of the scene was a grotesque mask for what was unfolding. Minnie and Lizzie, delighted by the prospect of sweets and too young to understand the danger, took the money. They watched as the man in the black coat lifted Fanny up in his arms. It was a moment that should have triggered alarm, but Baker played the part of the kindly stranger so well. He carried Fanny over the gate and set her down, and the two of them began to walk away, further into the hop garden, away from the safety of the public road. Minnie and Lizzie turned their backs, their minds filled with thoughts of sugar and treats, and ran back toward the village to spend their halfpence. They arrived home around 2 o'clock, their mouths stained with sweets, and played innocently in the yard. It was not until 5 o'clock that evening that the first ripple of panic began to disturb the Adams household. Harriet, realizing the sun was beginning to dip and cast long shadows across the lane, looked out for her eldest daughter. Seeing only Lizzie and Minnie, she asked where Fanny was. The girls, with the blameless honesty of children, explained that the man in the black coat had given them money for sweets and taken Fanny with him to the Leathers. A cold dread washed over Harriet. The Leathers was not a place for a child to be alone with a strange man. She immediately grabbed her shawl and set out toward the meadow, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She met an old woman on the path, a neighbor named Mrs. Gardner, and asked if she had seen the girl. Mrs. Gardner had seen nothing. Panic began to rise like bile in Harriet's throat. She hurried to the gate where the girls had last seen Fanny, scanning the rows of hops that grew tall and dense, creating a labyrinth of green where anything or anyone could be hidden. The silence of the meadow was deafening. There was no laughter, no rustling of a child playing hide and seek. Harriet called out Fanny's name, her voice cracking with escalating fear, but the only response was the rustle of the wind in the hop vines. She ran back to the house to alert her husband George, who had just returned from his labor. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, a grim foreshadowing of the horror that awaited them. The entire neighborhood was soon roused. Men lit lanterns, their faces grim, while women held their children close. They began to comb the area, shouting Fanny's name into the gathering darkness, praying that she had simply fallen asleep under a hedge or wandered too far and lost her way. But as the hours ticked by and the moon rose high and pale over Alton, the hope of finding Fanny safe began to wither, replaced by a collective, unspoken terror that something unspeakable had walked among them that day. If you want to uncover the truth buried in the hop fields, etch your name onto our subscriber list now. And tell me below, at what age were you first allowed to wander alone, and do you think that freedom exists anymore? As the sun finally surrendered to the horizon, painting the town of Alton in shades of bruising purple and charcoal gray, the atmosphere shifted from concern to a suffocating dread. It was now approaching 7 o'clock in the evening. The air, still thick with the humidity of the day, seemed to hold its breath. George Adams, Fanny's father, had returned from his labor to find his home in chaos and his wife, Harriet, on the verge of a breakdown. The news that his eldest daughter had walked off with a stranger struck him with the force of a physical blow. He did not waste a moment. Together with his neighbor, George Gates, he set out toward the road that led to the Leathers, his heavy boots pounding the dust, his eyes scanning the deepening shadows for the familiar silhouette of his child. While the search was beginning to fan out, a figure emerged from the direction of the hollow. It was Frederick Baker. He was walking back toward the town, his demeanor chillingly casual. He moved with a leisurely gait, unhurried and unbothered, as if he were merely returning from a pleasant evening stroll rather than the scene of a disappearance. He walked past the gate where he had taken the girls earlier, crossing paths with a frantic search party. Gardner, the neighbor who had been alerted by Harriet, saw him first. She recognized him immediately from the description the other children had given: the black frock coat, the tall hat, the air of educated respectability. With a courage born of desperation, Mrs. Gardner stepped into his path. She demanded to know what he had done with the child. Baker stopped. He did not run, nor did he show a flicker of guilt. He looked at the woman with a detached, almost bored expression. He admitted, quite readily, that he had spoken to the children. He claimed he had given them money for sweets, which was true, but then he delivered the lie. That would hang over him like a shroud. He told Mrs. Gardner that after giving Fanny the halfpenny, she had simply gone home to her mother. He spoke smoothly, his voice devoid of tremors, leveraging his status as a solicitor's clerk to appear above reproach. After all, why would a man of his standing harm a laborer's child? Baker brushed past the woman and continued his walk back into town, heading straight for his office at the solicitor's firm. He arrived there shortly after 7 o'clock. The clerk who worked alongside him, a man named Bignell, was already there. Baker entered the office, sat down at his desk, and did something that would later haunt everyone who heard the testimony. He lit his pipe. He sat there, in the dim light of the office, smoking calmly, discussing the heat of the day and trivial matters, while just a mile away, a mother was screaming her daughter's name into the void. The sheer audacity of his composure was psychopathic. He stayed there for some time, maintaining the facade of a man with nothing to hide, before stepping out again to visit a local pub, the Swan, for a drink. However, the town was not easily pacified. The story told by Minnie and Lizzie was too specific, too consistent. They were adamant that Fanny had not turned back. George Adams, fueled by a father's terrifying instinct, was not satisfied with the hearsay that the man had denied involvement. He, along with other men from the neighborhood, tracked Baker down. They found him later that evening, still wandering with that unsettling calmness. The confrontation was tense. The working-class men surrounded the educated clerk, the class divide bridging instantly under the weight of the tragedy. They demanded answers. Baker repeated his story. He gave her money. She went home. But this time, the facade cracked slightly, not with guilt, but with arrogance. He seemed insulted that he was being questioned. By 8 o'clock, the unease had crystallized into probable cause. Superintendent William Cheney, a veteran officer of the Hampshire Constabulary, was summoned. He found Baker and took him into custody, not yet charging him with murder, for there was no body, but holding him on suspicion of abduction. Baker was escorted to the local police station, protesting his innocence with the indignant tone of a man inconvenienced by the peasantry. He looked Superintendent Cheney in the eye and stated, "I am innocent. I love the child too well to hurt her," a statement that, in hindsight, carries a grotesque and sickening double meaning. While Baker sat in the police station, maintaining his mask of sanity, the search in the hop garden intensified. The darkness was now absolute, broken only by the flickering light of lanterns and the pale beams of the moon. The hop garden was a dense, claustrophobic place at night. The hop vines grew tall on wooden poles, creating narrow, leafy corridors that blocked out the light and sound. A laborer named Thomas Gates, who had joined the search party, was fighting his way through the thick vegetation near the area known as the flood meadow. The ground was uneven, the air smelling of earth and damp leaves. Thomas Gates was moving slowly, parting the heavy vines with his hands, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like a footstep. Every shadow looked like a small girl hiding. He reached a spot about 200 yards from where the girls had last seen Fanny. His foot struck something on the ground, or perhaps his light caught a flash of unnatural color amidst the relentless green. He lowered his lantern, squinting into the gloom. At first, his mind refused to process what he was seeing. It is a common defense mechanism of the human brain to reject horror, to categorize it as something mundane until it can no longer be denied. He thought, perhaps, he was looking at a discarded doll, or a bundle of rags left by a worker. But as he leaned closer, the light revealed the texture of skin, the terrible stillness of death. It was a head. Fanny Adams's head had been severed from her body. It had been placed, with a perverse sort of deliberation, upon 2 hop poles that had been laid across the ditch. The eyes that had sparkled with life just hours ago were now staring blankly into the darkness. Her long, light brown hair was matted and tangled. The sheer brutality of the sight caused Thomas Gates to recoil in a primal horror. He let out a shout, a sound that was half scream, half sob, that tore through the silence of the meadow and froze the blood of every man and woman searching in the dark. The search was over. The nightmare had begun. The discovery of the head was not the end of the horror, but merely the opening of a door into a room so dark that the people of Alton would never fully recover from what they found inside. If you have the stomach for what comes next, make sure you are subscribed. And tell me below, do you think Frederick Baker's calm demeanor was a sign of madness, or simply the arrogance of a man who thought he was untouchable? The scream that tore from Thomas Gates's throat was a sound of such primal despair that it seemed to stop the very rotation of the earth. It echoed off the wooden poles of the hop garden and rolled across the mist-covered meadow, a herald of absolute doom. Within seconds, the other men in the search party, their hearts pounding against their ribs, were sprinting toward the source of the cry. They crashed through the dense foliage, their lanterns swinging wildly, casting chaotic beams of light that sliced through the darkness. When they reached Gates, they found him standing frozen, his face the color of ash, pointing a trembling finger toward the ditch. One by one, the men lowered their lanterns, and one by one, they recoiled in a collective gasp of horror that sucked the air from the clearing. There, resting upon the two crossed hop poles like a macabre trophy, was the head of Fanny Adams. But the horror of the discovery was not limited to the decapitation. It was the sheer, calculated indignity of it. The face was slashed and mutilated. The long, soft hair that her mother had brushed that morning was now matted with dirt, leaves, and congealed blood. The eyes, which had looked upon the world with 8-year-old wonder, were gone gouged out with a violence that defied comprehension. They would later be found floating in the nearby riverway, discarded like refuse. The men stood in a stunned, reverent silence, unable to reconcile the sight before them with the reality of the quiet market town they called home. Superintendent William Cheney arrived at the scene shortly after, his presence bringing a grim semblance of order to the nightmare. But even he, a seasoned officer of the law, had to steel himself against the bile rising in his throat. The discovery of the head was merely the prologue to a much darker narrative written in blood across the meadow. The search party, now moving with a heavy funereal dread, began to fan out again to locate the rest of the child. It became a gruesome scavenger hunt in the dark, every rustle of the leaves threatening to reveal another piece of the atrocity. A few yards away from the head, they found the child's right leg and thigh. They had been severed from the trunk with a terrifying precision, suggesting not a frenzy of rage, but a methodical surgical dismantling. The limb had been thrown carelessly into the undergrowth. Moving further into the hops, the men discovered the torso. It had been stripped of its organs. The chest cavity was open and empty, the heart removed. This was not a murder. It was an evisceration. The killer had taken the time to dissect the child, to explore the anatomy of his victim with the cold curiosity of a butcher. The liver and other entrails were found scattered at a distance, flung high into the hop vines or buried in the dirt, as if the killer had reveled in the sheer chaos of the act. The left arm was found some distance away, ripped from the socket. The right arm was discovered later, hidden in a separate location. Every discovery was a fresh trauma for the men, neighbors who had watched Fanny grow up. But the most heartbreaking moment came when George Adams, the father, attempted to push through the line of men to see his daughter. The neighbors, with tears streaming down their soot-stained faces, formed a human wall. They grabbed George by the shoulders, restraining him with a desperate physical force. They knew that if he saw what lay in that field, the shattered, scattered remnants of his little girl, it would destroy his mind completely. He fought them, screaming his daughter's name, but they held him back, protecting him from the vision of hell that lay in the ditch. Dr. Louis Leslie, the local surgeon, was summoned to the field to oversee the collection of the remains. It was a task that required an iron constitution. The doctor noted the clean cuts on the limbs, the lack of jagged tearing that would suggest a struggle or a dull blade. This was the work of a sharp instrument and a steady hand. The men used a hopsack to gather the pieces of Fanny Adams. It was a solemn, horrific ritual. They had to hunt for her fingers, which had been cut off, and her ear, which had been sliced away. The sheer scale of the mutilation indicated that the killer had spent a significant amount of time with the body perhaps an hour or more hidden within the rows of hops while the sun was still high. As the sack was filled, a heavy, oppressive silence fell over the group. The rage that had been bubbling since the initial disappearance was now replaced by a cold, hard resolve. This was no longer about finding a lost child. It was about hunting a monster. The evidence at the scene told a story of a man who felt no fear, no rush, and absolutely no remorse. He had taken his time. He had enjoyed himself. And the terrifying realization hit Superintendent Cheney like a physical blow. The man they had in custody, Frederick Baker, had been calm. He had been smoking a pipe. He had been unbothered. The remains were carried in the sack back to the Leathers public house, which would serve as a temporary mortuary. The wet, red sack was placed on a table, a gruesome package that contained the entirety of a life cut short. Cheney knew he had to act fast. He had the body, or what was left of it, but he needed to cement the link to Baker before the sun rose. He needed to find the blood that the killer must surely be wearing. Leaving the doctors to their grim inventory, Cheney turned on his heel and marched back toward the police station, his face set in a mask of fury. He was going to confront the solicitor's clerk, and this time there would be no polite questions. He was going to strip the man's facade away, layer by layer, until he found the darkness hiding underneath. The evidence is mounting, but the killer is still playing games. If you want to see justice served, subscribe now. And tell me below, what is the most disturbing piece of evidence you've ever heard of in a historical case? Back at the Alton police station, the atmosphere was thick with a tension that threatened to snap at any moment. It was now late into the night of Saturday, August 24th, 1867. While the men in the hop garden were still collecting the fragmented remains of Fanny Adams, Superintendent William Cheney was standing across a wooden desk from Frederick Baker. The solicitor's clerk sat with an unnerving stillness, his posture relaxed, his expression one of mild annoyance rather than fear. Cheney, however, was vibrating with a suppressed rage. He had seen the carnage in the meadow. He knew that the person responsible was not human in the moral sense, but a monster wearing a man's skin. He looked at Baker, searching for a smudge of blood, a tremor of guilt, anything that would betray the butchery that had just occurred. Cheney began the formal procedure of searching the suspect. He ordered Baker to strip. The clerk complied, but with a haughty slowness, removing his black frock coat, his waistcoat, and finally his trousers. As the layers of respectability were peeled away, the damning evidence began to reveal itself. The trousers, Cheney noted immediately, were soaking wet. Not damp from the humidity of the day, but sodden, as if they had been scrubbed with water recently. When questioned about this, Baker replied smoothly that he had walked through a field of wet clover. It was a plausible lie, the kind a lawyer's clerk would concoct, but Cheney wasn't buying it. The weather had been scorching hot and dry all day. There was no wet clover to be found in Alton. As Cheney examined the wet fabric closer, holding the trousers up to the flickering gaslight, he saw them. Faint, dark stains that the water had failed to fully wash away. They were spots of blood, clinging to the fibers of the cloth. Baker shrugged them off. He claimed it was nothing more than a clumsy accident during a meal, or perhaps menstrual blood, a suggestion that was both crude and indicative of his low opinion of the officer's intelligence. But the most chilling discovery came when Cheney reached into the pockets of the waistcoat. He pulled out 2 small knives. They were not formidable weapons. They were small penknives, the kind used for sharpening quills or cutting tobacco. Cheney opened the blades. They were stained with blood. The metal was smeared with a dark, reddish residue that had congealed near the handle. Baker, without missing a beat, offered an explanation that bordered on the absurd. He said he had a habit of cutting his meat with his penknife, and that he had likely cut his finger recently. But Cheney knew what he had seen in the meadow. He knew the dismemberment of Fanny Adams had been precise, surgical. The realization that such a heinous act had been committed with these tiny, inadequate blades made the crime infinitely more horrific. It meant the killer had to have used significant force and spent a considerable amount of time hacking and sawing. It was a labor of hate. Then Cheney found the pocketbook. It was a small personal diary that Baker carried with him. The superintendent opened it, expecting perhaps to find appointments or legal notes. Instead, he found a window into a mind that was completely divorced from humanity. He flipped through the pages until he reached the current date, Saturday, August 24th. There, written in a neat, steady hand, was an entry that would become the centerpiece of the prosecution. It read, "Killed a young girl." It was fine and hot. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Cheney stared at the words. Killed a young girl. A confession, plain and simple, written with the same casual indifference one might use to record the purchase of a loaf of bread or a change in the weather. It was fine and hot. The juxtaposition of the brutal murder with the meteorological observation was psychopathic. It suggested that to Baker, the taking of a child's life was just another event in the day, no more significant than the sunshine. When Cheney confronted him with the diary, expecting a breakdown, Baker remained stoic. He claimed it was merely a note about the heat, or that the entry was being misinterpreted, but the ink was barely dry. News of the discovery in the hop garden had leaked out of the police station and spread through the town like wildfire. The initial shock of the community had hardened into a volcanic anger. By the time Sunday morning dawned, a mob had gathered outside the police station. These were not just the rough laborers of the fields. They were shopkeepers, mothers, fathers, the entire social fabric of Alton, united by a desire for vengeance. They threw stones at the station walls, chanting for Baker to be brought out. They wanted to tear him apart, to inflict upon him the same violence he had visited upon Fanny. The local police, overwhelmed by the ferocity of the crowd, realized they could not hold him there safely. Superintendent Cheney made the decision to transfer Baker to the county jail in Winchester. It was a perilous operation. As the police wagon emerged from the station, the crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of fists and fury. They clawed at the sides of the wagon, screaming, "Butcher!" and "Monster!" Baker, sitting inside, finally showed a flicker of fear. He crouched low, shielding his head as rocks shattered the windows of the carriage. The police had to whip the horses into a frenzy to break through the human barricade, leaving behind a town that was broken, bleeding, and demanding justice. The physical evidence was damning, the blood, the knives, the diary, but as the investigation moved to the courtroom, the true battle was just beginning. Baker was a man of law, and he would not go to the gallows without using every legal trick he knew to save his own skin. A diary entry is a smoking gun, but in 1867, the law was a tricky beast. If you want to see how a monster tries to escape the noose, make sure you are subscribed. And tell me below, if you found a diary like that today, would you hand it over immediately, or read the rest of the pages first? The trial of Frederick Baker began on the 5th of December, 1867, at the Winchester Assizes. The winter air was biting and cold, a stark contrast to the sweltering August heat in which the crime had been committed. Yet the atmosphere inside the courtroom was feverish. The great hall of Winchester Castle was packed to the rafters. The public gallery was a sea of grim faces, men and women who had traveled from all over Hampshire, driven by a morbid curiosity and a collective desire to see the man accused of such a monstrous atrocity. When Frederick Baker was led into the dock, a hush fell over the room that was heavier than silence. It was the sound of hundreds of people holding their breath. Baker stood tall, dressed impeccably in his black suit, his demeanor remaining unsettlingly calm. He bowed to the judge, Mr. Justice Mellor, with the practiced courtesy of a man who believed himself to be a peer of the court rather than a prisoner at the bar. The prosecution, led by Mr. Beer, wasted no time in laying out a narrative of calculated evil. They painted a picture of a man who had used his social standing to lure a defenseless child into a trap, only to butcher her with a savagery that defied human understanding. The evidence was presented piece by damning piece. The timeline was crucial. The prosecution established that between the hours of 2 o'clock, when the children left Baker, and 5 o'clock when he was seen returning to town, there was a window of opportunity where he was unaccounted for. These were the missing hours where the devil had done his work. Witnesses testified to seeing him near the hop garden, and others testified to his unhurried return. But the cornerstone of the Crown's case rested on the physical evidence found on his person and in his office. Dr. Alfred Swain Taylor, the most renowned toxicologist and forensic expert of the Victorian era, was called to the stand. His testimony was the scientific hammer that would shatter Baker's defense. Dr. Taylor had examined the clothes Baker had worn that day. He testified that despite the trousers having been washed, an act Baker claimed was due to wet clover, there were still traces of blood deep within the fibers. Furthermore, the water in the washstand at Baker's office had been found to contain diluted blood. But the most grotesque detail involved the knives. The defense argued vehemently that the small penknives found in Baker's pocket were incapable of dismembering a human body. They claimed it was physically impossible for such small blades to cut through bone and muscle in such a short time. Dr. Taylor, however, dismantled this argument with a chillingly clinical explanation. He told the jury that he had tested the knives and found them to be extremely sharp. He explained that because Fanny was a child, her bones were still soft and growing. The killer had not needed to hack through solid bone. He had simply sliced through the cartilage at the joints. It was a task, Dr. Taylor noted, that could easily be accomplished with a penknife by a man with a steady hand and knowledge of anatomy within less than an hour. The silence in the courtroom during this testimony was absolute. The image of the solicitor's clerk, sitting in the hop garden, methodically disjointing a child like a Sunday roast with a pocket knife, was a horror that turned the stomachs of even the most hardened observers. Then came the diary. The small, unassuming book was entered into evidence, and the entry for August 24th was read aloud. Killed a young girl. It was fine and hot. The defense counsel, desperate to explain away this confession, grasped at straws. They suggested that the entry was merely a memorandum of the news of the day, a note that a girl had been killed